please give a warm West Cork welcome to Nick McDowell. Okay, thanks very much. And I might even get a bit of Michael Longley in, so it might even be a longer span if I have time. So this talk really inaugurates a 2-year research grant that I've been given by the Leverhulme Trust in the UK, which will culminate in a book called, hopefully, The Poetry of Civil War. So I should thank the Trust for supporting a project which is somewhat experimental, in that it will try to develop a method for bringing together two periods of writing that are usually kept apart, but are connected by the historical experience of civil war, and that is 17th century Britain and 20th century Ireland. And I'd like to think that, therefore, that this paper, this talk, does fit in with one of the themes of the festival, which is to place the events of 20th century Ireland in a longer and broader historical perspective, and also a comparative perspective. But my perspective is coming from literature and from poetry. And there will be some overlap also with Robert Gerwath's paper from earlier as well, in my focus on the distinctive nature of civil war as an experience. Until quite recently, I think, it has been an underappreciated fact that we've been living in a time of civil war. And we heard a little bit about this earlier. The Harvard historian David Armitage, in his 2017 book, Civil Wars, A History and Ideas, has calculated that between 1989 and 2006, 115 of the world's 122 wars were fought within states rather than between states. And Armitage was writing before events such as the devastating civil war in Syria. And since at least the breakup of the Soviet Union then, civil war is by far the most common type of war that human beings experience. The ubiquity of civil war is perhaps one reason why Russia's return to a war of conquest in Ukraine caused such shock and surprise. And increasing attention has been paid, I think one of the main reasons increasing attention has been paid to the distinctive nature of civil war is because of the talk of the possibility of a new civil war in the United States, with titles such as Barbara Walters' How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them from last year becoming unexpected bestsellers. And last year, a poll by The Economist found that 43% of Americans think that civil war is very likely or somewhat likely in the next decade. That rises to 54% if you're a Republican. So the civil war is in the news again, and the starting point of my project is a simple one, that civil war is different from other types of war. That might seem obvious, but I think it bears thinking about for a moment. External wars often confer a sense of national unity. Civil war divides a nation, a region, a neighborhood, potentially even a family against itself. And the ancient Roman origins of the term convey this self-divisiveness, and I want to spend a bit of time thinking about the ancient Roman origins of civil war. So the Latin term for civil war, bellum civile, denoted a just war, bellum, against citizens, cives. But for the Romans, a just war could, by definition, only be waged against external enemies, hostes. So the notion of a just war against Roman citizens was thus a contradiction in terms, and an unnatural, grotesque concept. The very term civil war, in its Latin origins then, originates in a kind of paradox, a contradiction in terms. And the Romans dreaded civil war above all wars and called it intestine, a rupture within the body, literally a rupture within the body of the civil community, which brings bestial violence within the city walls. And Tom Holland, in his just published Pax, War and Peace in Rome's Golden Age, sees the Romans' experience of the horrors of civil war as the key to understanding the whole history of the Roman Empire. Peace was the prime virtue for an emperor, but Pax was defined as the absence of wars in which Romans fought other Romans. The destruction and enslavement of other peoples, however, was an entirely different matter and quite justifiable. And the great Roman poet of civil war, Lucan, who I'll refer to a few times in this talk, has a soldier in his first century epic about the civil war between Caesar and Pompey supplicate to the gods to make us again the enemies of all peoples, only ward off civil war. Or as the 17th century translator of Lucan, Thomas May, put it more pithily, make us all people's foes, so not our own. So I think Holland is right to see the fear of civil war, the horror of civil war, as absolutely the motivating force behind the Roman Empire. And this Roman tradition of thinking about civil war shaped subsequent historiographical, legal, and political conceptions of civil war. David Armitage argues powerfully in Civil Wars, A History and Ideas, for a trans-temporal history of civil war, stretching from ancient Rome to the contemporary world, a history which is not only comparative, but also stresses the mechanisms of connection between moments. And there you can see some overlap with what those of you at Robert Gerwarth's talk earlier, some overlaps there by the comparative and connected idea of civil war. Civil war should be treated, according to Armitage, as both a historical and cumulative concept. That is, whenever the spectre of civil war arose, it did so in forms that recalled previous conflicts. Now, my own project, The Poetry of Civil War, extends Armitage's argument for a comparative and a connected history of civil war to literary and specifically poetic forms. The Roman legacy of civil war was poetic as well as historical, transmitted through the verse of Virgil, Horace, and Lucan, as well as the histories of Tacitus, Appian, and Sallust. The Roman tradition shaped subsequent historiographical, legal, and political conceptions of war in the West, a civil war in the West, and its literary traditions also shaped the subsequent imaginative representation of civil war. Roman ways of seeing civil war became embedded in Western culture through the Renaissance humanist curriculum, which only really began to decline rapidly in Europe in the 1960s, and was still preserved, if in much attenuated form, in the education of those Northern Irish poets who came to prominence in the 1970s. As I say, I hopefully have time to think about one of those in the form of Michael Longley. Now, as the Romans recognized, civil war is uniquely traumatic both to a country's material landscape and to the psychology of its people, but it has also elicited rich and intense poetic experiences and responses. I grew up in Belfast in the 1970s and 1980s during what is now widely regarded as a form of civil war, though there has inevitably been some dispute, both in analytical and political contexts, over whether the situation in Northern Ireland from 1969 to 94 should be described as a civil war. But it's been used a few times already at the festival, and it's widely accepted now in academic study, with some caveats about numbers of dead and so on. I think it's certainly not a term I remember being used when I was growing up for the conflict. And of course, to talk about it as civil war does have political implications. But it is, if you look in sociological and historical studies now, civil war, Northern Ireland is included as a form of civil war. And as Andrew said, I've devoted much of my own academic career to studying the cultural and literary effects of the civil wars in 17th century Britain and Ireland. And I don't think that's a coincidence, actually. I mean, the two conflicts are, of course, historically connected. And that's part of the story I want to tell. But it's only a part of it. In this new book, The Poetry of Civil War, I want to bring together the English language poetry of the 17th century civil wars with that of 20th century Ireland to ask, can poetry about conflict within the state be recognized as a genre distinct in its recurring images, motifs, and themes from writing about wars between states? And I should say my focus is on English language poetry, but I'm very interested in the question of whether these characteristic motifs can also be found in poetry in Irish and Scots Gaelic, which I don't have expertise in. So I'll maybe return to that question of language in questions, or if I have time to do so in the end. Now, there have, of course, been many enlightening critical accounts dedicated discreetly to poetry written in Britain during the 1640s and 1650s, or in Ireland during the early 1920s, or in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. But there's never been a concerted argument for a category of Civil War poetry in the English language that crosses temporal boundaries. Poems written during civil war in both the 17th and 20th centuries have rather been included in cross-period anthologies and critical studies under the larger category of war poetry. Much has been written about the debt of modern Irish verse to poetry of the First World War. In Poetry and the Wars in 1986, Edna Longley brilliantly compared the situation and self-consciousness of Northern Irish poets during the Troubles to that of poets during the World Wars. And a later notable work of criticism on this topic is Fran Brereton's The Great War in Irish Poetry, W.B. Yeats to Michael Longley from 2000. But As I discovered when I started working on this, I mean, almost nothing has been said about possible relationships with verse of the 17th century, which also explores the experience of war specifically within the state and its very different set of conditions. There is no cross-period anthology of Civil War poetry in Britain and Ireland. Now, because the Irish Civil War and Northern Ireland Troubles are directly historically connected to the events of the 17th century wars, in particular the Cromwellian conquest of the 1650s, and obviously the Battle of the Boyne in 1690, Irish writers naturally look back to those events. One of the more obvious examples would be Brendan Kennelly's extraordinary serio-comic sequence, Cromwell, from 1983, which some of you may know, which amongst a multitude of other things imagines Cromwell as the manager of Drogheda United Football Club. If you haven't ever read Cromwell, I do much recommend it. But there are also several rich examples of poetic responses specifically to the poetry that emerged from the 17th century civil wars. Seamus Deane explicitly addressed the relation between Irish history and English poetic tradition in what I think is one of his most powerful poems, Reading Paradise Lost in Protestant Ulster, 1984. And Deane, in that poem, observes the historical irony for an Irish nationalist reader of Paradise Lost in late 20th century Ulster of the description by John Milton, a propagandist for the state which sent Cromwell to Ireland, of God as sovereign planter. And the phrase appears in Book 4 of Paradise Lost in describing the domestic paradise created for Adam and Eve in Eden before their fall into sin. And Paradise Lost, of course, being Milton's great epic poem about the fall of man. And so I've given it to you on the screen. You can see it's in original spelling because that's how Deane refers to it. Thus talking hand in hand alone they passed, this is Adam and Eve, on to their blissful bower. It was a place chosen by the sovereign planter when he framed all things to man's delightful use. The roof of thickest covert was inwoven shade, laurel and myrtle, and what higher grew of firm and fragrant leaf. So this is Eden in its unfallen, perfect state. Now in Deane's poem, which again I much recommend if you don't know it, the sovereign planter is a parody of this divine authority, personifying rather the legacy of Protestant plantation and Cromwellian conquest, which has been to turn the idyllic pastoral landscape of Ulster into the hell of civil war. And this is just an extract from Deane's poem. Our sovereign planter beats upon his breast dyadic evil rules, a syncope that stammers in our guns, that forms and reforms itself in schools and in our daughters' couplings and our sons. We feel the fire's heat, Belial's doze, a maiden city's burning on the plain. Rebels surround us, Lord. Ah, whence arose this dark damnation, this hot, unrainbowed rain? Now, the maiden city is, of course, Derry stroke Londonderry, so called because its walls were never breached during three major 17th century sieges, including in 1649 when it was held by the English parliamentarian army against a combined force of Catholic Irish and English royalists. Milton himself, in his only work explicitly addressing Ireland, comments on how the parliamentary forces are besieged in Londonderry by the Irish rebels in his anonymous 1649 prose work, Observations upon the Irish Rebels. This was also his first official publication commissioned by the English Republican government. As Milton, soon after the execution of Charles I, Milton went into print to defend the execution. The new Republican government recognized his literary skills and immediately appointed him essentially as their chief propagandist. And this piece on Ireland was his first commissioned publication. It's a piece that I edited a few years ago for the Oxford Complete Works of John Milton. He's very scathing, particularly about Belfast, which he calls a barbarous nook. And he particularly dislikes the Ulster Presbyterians because he feels they've betrayed the revolution. The Presbyterians had gone back to the side of Charles I in the late 1640s. So he's really actually focused on the Presbyterians rather than the Irish, Catholic Irish. But what I'm interested in here in Deane's poem is that the original dyadic evil of the fall, the dyadic divisive, dividing in two, in Paradise Lost, divides Adam and Eve, man and God, and destroys the blissful bower of Eden. So dyadic comes from dyad. In Dean's poem, this dyadic evil has penetrated the walls of the supposedly unbreachable maiden city, where Catholic fights Protestant, nationalist fights loyalist, turning the city into a version of the hell to which Satan and the rebel angels fall in Paradise Lost, with its famous darkness visible. It is also an evil that has been passed on through generations, like original sin. But for Dean, it also has a source, I think, in the 17th century colonisation of Ireland, and so it is an evil in which Milton himself and his poem, and by extension perhaps the whole English literary tradition, are implicated. Now, Dean's poem, I think, suggests the potential for literary history that would directly connect the moments of civil war in Britain and Ireland. It also exemplifies how entwined modern Irish conflict is with the archipelagic politics of the 1640s, or the Wars of the Three Kingdoms, as historians now often prefer to call the 17th century wars, in recognition of their Scottish and Irish dimensions. And we'll be hearing from Paul Lay later about this. The ambivalent relationship between Northern Irish poets and their 17th century ancestors will repay closer attention. And for example, Seamus Heaney attested in Stepping Stones, his autobiographical interviews with Denis O'Driscoll, to the sudden powerful admiration he felt for the 17th century poetry of Andrew Marvell, while teaching English at a further education college in the mid-1970s. Heaney cites specifically Marvell's best-known political poem, An Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland. And I've given you, I won't go into it too much, you can read there the little dialogue between O'Driscoll and Heaney. I'll come back to it maybe in a moment. I think it's very fascinating for my purposes, of course, but fascinating generally about the way Heaney's mind was working in the 70s. Now, Marvell's poem, An Horatian Ode upon Cromwell's Return from Ireland, is a poem that ostensibly celebrates Cromwell's return in 1650 from his conquest of Ireland. Yet Marvell's praise of Cromwell is packed with irony and uncertainty, with almost every line capable of sustaining double meanings that hint at anxiety about Cromwell's potential for brutal tyranny. And one assumes, although unfortunately he doesn't tell us, that Heaney perceived such ironies in Marvell's lines on the subdued Irish. And that's a picture of Andrew Marvell, by the way. Now the Irish are ashamed to see themselves in 1 year tamed. So much one man can do that does both act and know. They can affirm his praises best, and have, though overcome, confessed how good he is, how just, and fit for highest trust. Now it's very hard to know if Marvell's being serious there, or if you read the poem as a whole, he's constantly has double meanings about Cromwell, which express his anxiety, I think, about Cromwell's violence, his potential for violence. Unlike his older friend John Milton, who had more or less supported the parliamentary cause from the beginning, Marvell had found himself caught between various forms of allegiance during the English civil wars, between his friendship with royalists and poets who stayed loyal to the king, and his need as someone from a modest background to establish a career for himself in the service of the Cromwellian state. And Marvell's poems of the 1640s and 50s are the most interesting examples of Civil War verse in the 17th century, precisely because Marvell himself is divided in his loyalties. And that's really my concern in this project and book, is not with exercises in propaganda, but with lyric reflection, and with writers like Marvell and Heaney, and also Yeats, who I'm going to come to, who feel the pull of competing allegiances, competing traditions, who pull them in different directions. I mean, you know, and intriguingly, I think, as I say, just to go back to that for a moment, Heaney links his reading of Marvell both to a new appreciation of Yeats's political verse, which he says he started reading intensely around the same time, and to his own working out, as he puts it, of a position or a stance in relation to the place and the times we were inhabiting. So I think it's very important with, you know, to think about, you know, cross-period influences on poets like Heaney as well. You know, someone like Heaney is an international. He's a European poet. He's translating the classics. You know, he's reading back in English poetry back to the 17th century, and that's true of most of the major Northern Irish poets. Now, these issues of literary influence and transmission offer one way of connecting these periods of writing about civil war. But as I said earlier, I want to go beyond instances of direct influence between poets from the different periods to explore how motifs of Civil War writing have become part of a process of what I would call literary and conceptual sedimentation over the centuries. with the consequence that poets may often be unaware of their classical origins or early modern applications. So it's in the sense that, in a way, that these motifs pass into Western culture, partly through their origin in classical writing. If civil war is recognized, in Armitage's terms, as both a historical and a cumulative concept with its origins in Roman narratives, then writing about the experience of civil war, whether in London in 1649 or in Dublin in 1923 or in Belfast in 1972, will involve thinking through characteristic tropes and images of the genre, even when there are very different ideas of community and nationhood at stake. And of course, these are very different periods in Rome, in ancient Rome and London in 1649, but they all involve thinking about the experience of civil war. So in the rest of this talk, I want to trace one of the most significant of these motifs or tropes of Civil War poetry through poems from ancient Rome, 17th century England, and 20th century Ireland. And one of my guides here is several lectures by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben, and these lectures have stimulated sort of theoretical interest in civil war and the humanities. They were published in 2015 under the title Stasis, Civil War as Political Paradigm. And my own approach has been influenced by the category confusions that Agamben identifies as constitutive of classical concepts of civil war. As Agamben puts it, civil war assimilates and makes undecidable brother and enemy, inside and outside, household and city. The killing of what is most intimate is indistinguishable from the killing of what is most foreign. Civil war is driven then by the tragic dissolution of the boundaries between household and state, creating what Agamben calls a war within the household. Okay, so that idea that the Civil War in particular operates differently, and it makes porous those boundaries between brother and enemy, inside and outside, household and city. I want to turn for a moment to Lucan's Roman epic called the Bellum Coele, the Civil War. And the opening lines of Lucan's epic immediately convey the horror of this existential confusion between brother and enemy, between what is most intimate and what is most foreign. And this, first of all, is the 1627 translation by Thomas May, which I think is particularly powerful. Wars more than civil, this is the opening lines of the poem. Wars more than civil on Emathian plains we sing, rage licensed, where great Rome disdains in her own bowels her victorious swords. Where kindred hosts encounter, all accords of empire broke, where armed to impious war, the strength of all the shaken world from far is met. No one ensigns do defy, piles, against eagles, eagles fly. Now, Rome stabs the sword in her own bowels, and in an image of self-reflexive violence, which becomes typical of writing about civil war. Kindred hosts who should be welcoming each other into their households instead encounter each other on the battlefield, conveying the sense of civil society being split apart from within. And finally, the way in which allies who have become enemies are reflections of each other is conveyed in the repetitions of the final lines. Ensigns face ensigns, piles face piles, eagles face eagles. And a pile is a specifically Roman term for a javelin. And the eagle is, of course, the symbol of the Roman army. So the mighty imperial army has turned in upon itself. And as one classical scholar has written of Lucan's poem, civil war is a state of being which has invaded every level of things, from the cosmos to the individual, to the poet and his language. I think those opening lines from Lucan concentrate a lot of the motifs that you find in Civil War writing right up to Troubles poetry in the 1970s. And Lucan goes on in his opening to articulate the dissolution of the boundaries between the domestic and the foreign, between inside and outside, in the form of a war within the household. Here I've preferred the more literal translation, modern translation by Susan Braund. But now the walls are tumbling in the towns of Italy, the houses half destroyed, and the defences collapsed, the huge stones lie. No guardian occupies the homes, and in the ancient cities wanders only an occasional inhabitant. No foreign sword has ever penetrated so. It is wounds inflicted by the hand of fellow citizens that have sunk deep. Now, these images of the disintegration of the boundary between inside and outside, in the form of violence penetrating or arising within the walls of the city and the household, continually recur in writing about civil war. in 17th century Britain, but also in 20th century Ireland. We've already seen one manifestation of the motif in Seamus Dean's Miltonic images of the maiden city, the walls of which may have held firm in 17th century battles, but have been penetrated from within by the dyadic evil of sectarianism infecting its citizens. The motif also overlaps with one of the most characteristic themes of 20th century Irish literature, the decline and destruction of the big house, with all the heavy significance that the big house carries as a material embodiment of Anglo-Irish culture. And Yeats's extraordinary 1923 sequence, Meditations in Time of Civil War, is key to this fascination in Irish literature with the big house. But as I want to say, Yeats's poem also transmits images and tropes which are characteristic of the classical and Renaissance poetic traditions of representing the experience of civil war. So to show how Yeats's Meditations fits into this tradition of Civil War writing, the features of which operate trans-historically, but which are ultimately classical in origin, I want to look briefly at two poems from the mid-17th century. Firstly, a sonnet written by Milton in 1642, the year in which Civil War broke out in England. And secondly, a poem by Andrew Marvell called Upon Appleton House, probably written around 1651 in the aftermath of Civil War and the execution of Charles I. And it's appropriate that we're in an estate here talking about these poems because they do deal with the kind of the dissolution of the boundaries of the estate. So the poem by Milton, first of all, before this is preparing to think about the way the motifs operate in Yeats and beyond. So this is the sonnet by Milton. In November 1642, the advance of the Royalist army on London seemed inexorable as a parliamentary force was easily defeated at Brentford. And Charles I surprisingly withdrew later in the month when he seemed to have London at his mercy, and the Royalist forces could have taken London. So Milton likely wrote this sonnet in this period in November 1642 when it seemed the Royalist army was about to invade London. Milton was then living in Aldersgate Street, named after one of the northern gates in the London Wall that was built by the Romans to enclose the city. And the sonnet was originally titled On His Door When the City Expected an Assault. This is the whole poem. Captain or colonel or knight in arms, whose chance on these defenceless doors may seize, if ever deed of honour did thee please, guard them, and him within protect from harms. He can requite thee, for he knows the charms that call fame on such gentle acts as these. And he can spread thy name o'er land and seas. Whatever clime the sun's bright circle warms, lift not thy spear against the muse's bar. The great Emathian conqueror bid spare the house of Pindarus when temple and tower went to the ground, and the repeated air of sad Electra's poet had the power to save the Athenian walls from ruin bare. Now the final lines in this sonnet allude to the story in Plutarch of how the singing of the first chorus from Euripides' Electra by a defeated Athenian moved the victorious Spartans to halt their planned destruction of the city. The sonnet, as I've said, was originally entitled On His Door When the City Expected an Assault. In other words, Milton imagined posting the poem on his door, on the threshold of his domestic space, as a kind of charm that would ward off the violence of the invading soldier, in this case, royalist soldier. The tone of the poem is light, and its faith in the power of art to civilize humanity, and just as importantly, to protect the artist, is uplifting. The compact form of the sonnet, the 14 lines, materially reflects its theme by embodying the protected space of the poet's home. Yet this is a pretty fragile defense, and the concluding phrase, ruin bare, echoes the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang of Shakespeare's Sonnet 73, an image which in Shakespeare's poem reflects upon the ruin of the monasteries in the English Reformation. That final allusion, the way it ends with ruin bare, I think suggests the verses posted on the poet's door are, as I say, a fragile barrier against the violence of civil war and a threat that will penetrate the sanctity of the home, dissolving the boundaries between inside and outside. Now, 9 years later, in 1651, after Parliament had won the war and the king had been publicly executed, Andrew Marvell moved back from London to his native Yorkshire to work as a tutor to the daughter of Sir Thomas Fairfax at the Fairfax country estate in Nunn Appleton. Fairfax had led the parliamentarian New Model Army during the Civil Wars alongside Cromwell as his second-in-command. But Fairfax, amongst other things, was somewhat upset by the execution of the king, an act that went further than he had wanted, and he finally retired his command in disagreement with Cromwell's military expedition to Scotland in 1650. As soon as Cromwell came back from Ireland, he went off to Scotland. Not quite the same ferocity, but again, returned from Scotland victorious. The return to Appleton House for Fairfax was a kind of form of retirement from public life, but also an attempt to escape a turn of historical events for which Fairfax was partly responsible, but they regarded as having become excessive. The job as tutor at Appleton House also represented a form of escape for Marvell from the politics of London, where he seems to have been searching for a patron or for a job. Later in the mid-1650s, he would become tutor to Cromwell's nephew and a civil servant in the Cromwellian government, working alongside Milton. In Upon Appleton House, which is likely written on the estate in 1651 and consists of 97 stanzas, each composed of 4 rhyming couplets, Marvell adopts the mode of the estate poem to debate with himself, and perhaps with his employer Fairfax, to whom the poem is addressed, about whether the idyllic life of seclusion and contemplation in the house and gardens of the country estate can ever really offer refuge from the external world of civil war. And the answer, you might not be surprised to hear, is that there can be no true escape, for what Dean calls the dyadic evil of civil war is inside the walls of the great house, inside its natural landscape, and inside the minds of those who've experienced the conflict. The speaker initially greets the house as embodying the values of that more sober age and mind in which it was constructed, and gives a lengthy account of its foundation by Fairfax's ancestors, in place of a nunnery that was dissolved during the English Reformation. So immediately we see that Appleton House, for all its order and sobriety, only exists because of an earlier violent religious division within England. The speaker then takes us on a guided tour of the estate, and clearly wishes to see Appleton as a second Eden, a place from a time before the apple was eaten, offering refuge from a fallen world through a union of the self with nature. I've just given you a couple of examples of how the speaker of the poem very lightly moves through the estate. But I, retiring from the flood, take sanctuary in the wood, and while it lasts, myself embark in this yet green, yet growing ark. Thus I, easy philosopher, among the birds and trees can fare, and little now to make me once, or of the fowls, or of the plants. Give me but wings as they, and I, straight floating on the air, shall fly. Or turn me but, and you shall see, I was but an inverted tree. So amazing. It's an amazing poem with these surprising images throughout. But the speaker's description of place are constantly pulling us back to the outside world of civil war, division, and death. Fairfax himself, it has already been revealed, cannot help but continue planning military campaigns in his flower beds, who, when retired here to peace, his warlike studies could not cease, but laid these figures out in sport in the just figure of a fort. And the natural world itself is described in martial terms. The bee through these known allies hums, beating the Daean with its drums, and the Daean is apparently a military drum roll. As the speaker moves outside the planned gardens into the rest of the estate, violence and death are found everywhere in the natural world, with the grass of the estate's meadow massacred by the whistling scythe of the mower, who, unknowing, also carves through a corncrake. And I've given you that there. So this kind of random violence is in nature itself. And Tom Paulin, who I'd say is probably the Irish poet who's been more self-consciously influenced by 17th century poetic example than any other, has described the warlike imagery of Upon Appleton House as a metaphor for the political consciousness during a time of revolution. And Marvell shows how such a consciousness sees politics everywhere. But I would say the imagery is more specifically a metaphor for such a consciousness during a time of civil war rather than revolution. And that's maybe one of the things that's going to come out, there needs to be talked about a bit more about what the difference between civil war and a revolution is. The flooding of the meadow by an overflowing river is described in terms of a series of paradoxes that recall the etymology of the term bellum coele, or civil war, in paradox. The river in itself is drowned, and isles the astonished cattle round. Let others tell the paradox, how eels now bellow in the ox, how horses at their tails do kick, turned as they hang to leeches quick, how boats can over bridges sail, and fishes do the stable scale, how salmons trespassing are found, and pikes are taken in the pound. So the kind of world turned upside down within the estate. These lines have found their way into the Chatto book of nonsense poetry, though to treat them as nonsense, I think, risks obscuring the extent to which they distill the classical literary tradition of civil war as a horrifying inversion of the proper order of things, a turning inside out of the body politic. The flood is also a Roman image of civil war, and the bellum coele Lucan greatly exaggerates previous accounts of the scale of the flood that resulted from the bursting of the banks of the river Sicarus, leaving Caesar's army stranded on a peninsula, to evoke what one classicist has called imagery of cosmic dissolution, of pressure on boundaries whose collapse is imminent. So over 776 lines, the poet in Appleton House walks back around the estate and then to the house over the course of a day, and he comes to an understanding that his dream of perfect order and unity in the estate is a fantasy. The poet makes clear his admiration for the moral and domestic values of his patron, but Fairfax's attempts to retire completely from the public world of division and conflict are shown to be as naive as the poet's own dream of erasing his experience and memory of division through some sort of ecstatic mystical unity with nature. The divisions cannot be shut out by the walls of the estate because they arose from within, from the history of the land and from the passions of the men who inhabit both house and nation. And so in the last 10 minutes of the talk, I want to then turn to Yeats and briefly Michael Longley and try and show why I've spent some time thinking about these earlier poems and what they might tell us. W.B. Yeats was, like Andrew Marvell, divided in his allegiances. He looked both to an older cultural order, that of the Protestant Anglo-Irish ascendancy, which had dominated political and cultural life in Ireland since the late 17th century, and to the new Irish nationalism of the early 20th century, which he had sympathised intellectually and emotionally, but he also recognised as a destructive, violent force, tearing down much of what he admired in Anglo-Irish society. And prime, as I've said, among the targets during the Irish Civil War of the IRA, during the Irish War of Independence and the Civil War, were the so-called big houses, the country estates, established by Anglo-Irish landowners on land that in many cases had been confiscated from the native Catholic inhabitants during the Cromwellian conquest and later in the Restoration. And I believe the statistic is that between December 1921 and March 1923, 192 big houses were burnt down. Now, the first part of Yeats's sequence, Meditations in Time of Civil War, which he dates 1923, but was first published in 1928 in his volume, The Tower. I'll come back to that title. The first part of Yeats's sequence considers the origins of such ancestral houses, which is the name of the first part of the sequence, in the vision, patronage, and skill of bitter and violent men. Some violent, bitter man, some powerful man, called architect and artist in, that they, bitter and violent men, might rear in stone the sweetness that all longed for night and day. The poet is entranced by the ordered classical beauty, the sweetness embodied by the big houses, even while he acknowledges their origin in barbarism. Oh, what if gardens where the peacock strays with delicate feet upon old terraces, or else old Juno from an urn displays before the indifferent garden deities? Or what if levelled lawns and gravelled ways where slippered contemplation finds his ease, and childhood a delight for every sense, but take our greatness with our violence? Now, this language, I would say, is notably Marvellian, where slippered contemplation finds his ease, recalls Marvell's easy philosopher, and both Upon Appleton House and Ancestral Houses have an 8-line stanza form, though Yeats employs ottava rima, whereas Marvell uses his trademark rhyming couplets. And Yeats had been reading, I won't go into it now, but Yeats had been reading Marvell earlier in his life and has some interesting things to say about Marvell, which, as far as I know, have never been discussed by anyone. Now, the great American critic Marjorie Perloff argued over a century ago that another Yeats poem, Cool Park in Ballylee, 1931, likely has a model in the anxious meditation upon the vulnerability of the aristocratic patronage tradition in Marvell's Upon Appleton House. Perloff observes that both estate poems have as their backdrop the menacing shadow of civil war, comparing the flooding of the meadow in Upon Appleton House to the darkening flood which threatens to envelop Cool Park in the final moments of Yeats's poem. But Meditations in Time of Civil War was composed closer to the experience of civil war than Cool Park in Ballylee, 1931. And I think Ancestral Houses, the first part of Meditations, shares with Marvell's interrogation of the country house genre an urgent concern with the capacity of the achievements of aristocratic patronage to endure in the aftermath of a bloody internal conflict they may not, in fact, yet have concluded. Now, in this context, Yeats is as I probably don't need to tell anybody in this audience, a deceptively difficult poem. In terms of the language he uses, often quite simple, but in terms of syntax and meaning, extremely complex. And in this context, the final line of the fourth stanza of Ancestral Houses, but take our greatness with our violence, question mark, turns the thought of the poet in an unexpected direction. After evoking the classical splendor of the big house, the poet wonders if such aesthetic achievement actually works to diminish the greatness of the bitter and violent men of the 17th and 18th centuries who first built the houses. The greatness of men is measured, it would seem, in their engagement in the public world of conflict, not in retirement to the brittle beauty of their estates. The poet debates with himself whether the nationalist violence against the big house is a painful but necessary stage in the historical and cultural renovation of Ireland, in the renewal of its greatness. There is also an implicit analogy, as there is in Marvel, between the structure of the big house and the form of the poem which describes it. The ordered classicism of ancestral houses and the sort of poetry conventionally written under aristocratic patronage appears in the context of civil war, about as responsive to the modern world of violent political change as a classical urn in the estate garden. Now, in the second part of Meditations, entitled simply My House, the poet retreats to his own version of the big house, in Yeats's case, the Norman Tower at Ballylee, and there it is on your screen, part of the Cool Park estate in Galway. And Yeats spent his summers at the Cool Park estate under the patronage of Lady Gregory, and eventually purchased the Ballylee Tower from her, and lived in it from 1921 to 9. Tor Ballylee is presented initially as an escape for the poet from the fury and noise of public life into the aesthetic life of contemplation and poetic inspiration. So that's his retreat into the tower, trying to escape the public world and back into the world of contemplation and poetry. But by the sixth section, the most famous section of Meditations in Time of Civil War, The Stairs Nest by My Window, the speaker has come to acknowledge the impossibility of the artist removing himself from the public world of conflict. As Ballylee Tower itself begins to loosen and crumble, its walls unable to withstand the violent processes at work in history. And these are famous lines. The bees build in the crevices of loosening masonry, and there the mother birds bring grubs and flies. My wall is loosening. Honeybees come build in the empty house of the stair. We are closed in, and the key is turned on our uncertainty. Somewhere a man is killed or a house burned, yet no clear fact to be discerned. Come build in the empty house of the stair. A barricade of stone or of wood, some 14 days of civil war. Last night they trundled down the road, that dead young soldier in his blood. Come build in the empty house of the stair being a starling. The crumbling Norman tower is contrasted with the hurriedly constructed but apparently solid barricade of stone or wood, which represents the divisions of civil war. And that's also an image in Lucan's Bellum Coele, the barricade created by Caesar at Brundisium, is a key image of civil war. In the movement of Yeats's Meditations in Time of Civil War, we might recall the progressive disillusionment of the speaker upon Appleton House, yearning to leave the public world of civil war outside the gates of the estate and become an easy philosopher among the birds and trees. Yeats's sequence is comparable to Marvel's turning inside out of the country house genre, in that it enacts the realization of the speaker that the contemplative life of the artist in the big house of the tower can never be sealed off from the external world of bitterness and violence. The big houses themselves founded on bitterness and violence. The internal divisions of civil war seem likely to sweep them away, and with them the aristocratic patronage culture that they embody and that Yeats so admired. Well, just to finish, very briefly, Meditations in Time of Civil War is the key means by which the motifs of Civil War poetry have been transmitted to poetry of the Troubles. It is, as Seamus Heaney acknowledged in his essay, Yeats as an example, probably the central work in the Northern Irish poetic imagination of civil war. And in his landmark anthology of Troubles poems, A Rage for Order, Frank Ormsby, the recent Ireland professor of poetry, who also happened to teach me English at school in the late 80s, uses a stanza from The Stairs Nest by My Window as an epigraph. I've only time to gesture aside towards the ways in which I hope to extend my arguments to poetry of the Troubles. And this is a paragraph. Although far from the grandeur of the country estate, a particularly powerful instance of the dissolution of boundaries between domestic and foreign, inside and outside, is Michael Longley's The Civil Servant. The first part of the triptych reads in Longley's 1979 volume, The Echo Gate. The reader follows the trajectory of the bullet, which pierces not only the physical boundaries of the home, but the skull of its owner. The murder of a man who is supposed to serve civil society becomes emblematic of the collapse of that society, and indeed of civility itself amid civil war. He was preparing an Ulster fry for breakfast when someone walked into the kitchen and shot him. A bullet entered his mouth and pierced his skull, the books he had read, the music he could play. Now, Michael Longley, who studied classics at Trinity and whose work is deeply influenced by Greek and Latin example, has hinted at his conception of the tragic nature of the event that he describes in this poem in the classical sense of a violation of the boundary of the home, or what the Greeks called the oikos. When somebody walks into a home where there's a smell of cooking and where BBC radio is playing music and takes out a gun, they are offending the gods, really. They are desecrating civilization. And Edna Longley has called The Civil Servant an example of civil war elegy, drawing comparison but also distinction with the Great War elegy, which she discussed in Poetry in the Wars. So this distinction between the poetry of war and the poetry of civil war seems to me a more vital one than has been realized, and it is this distinction that I will pursue, I hope, as I write the poetry of civil war over the next couple of years. Thanks very much.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for that stimulating romp through the history of Civil War poetry, from Lucan to Marvell, Yeats to Longley. I'm very struck by that continuum. I'm sure there'll be a moment now for questions. If I could borrow a roving mic, I'll skip around the room and take your questions as they arise.
Thanks very much. Is this on?
I'm not sure it is. Yeah.
You take me back to my days as a schoolboy. 2 points. First of all, Armitage, for some reason, excludes entirely the Hellenic world in terms of its definitions of civil war and so on. Yeah. I think he's wrong. Yeah. And secondly, arising from that, I mean, he therefore takes from you the Iliad, which arguably is a quintessential Civil War poem. So, I mean, my complaint is with Armitage rather than with you. And just finally, a point, it's not a point of correction because I'm probably wrong. In school, we learnt that the repeated air of Sad Electra's poet, that was a reference to the prisoners of the Athenian expedition in Sicily. That the survivors survived. They were forced to mine and so on. But ultimately, the Spartans allowed them to live and to go home, precisely because they were able to do that. But that's only a small point, and that's probably why I only got a C in Greek. Thank you.
I'm sure a C in Greek is very impressive these days. Yeah, well, that's a good. The second point, that's interesting. I mean, I'll think about that. I mean, all the annotations simply refer to what. But the first point about I mean, I obviously had to curtail a little bit. Didn't want to go into too much detail, but actually, you're right. So David Armitage's book says that civil war was invented by the Romans essentially, and it didn't exist before that, which not everyone would agree with. The Greeks had a form of conflict between aristocratic families, which they call stasis. And that's what actually the Italian philosopher Agamben talks about in that quotation I give you. So, I mean, I would broadly agree with you, actually. I mean, I think there is you maybe got a sense of it there from what I was talking about with Longley, that I think a lot of Greek tragedy stems from the confusion of the oikos, the household, and the polis, the civil state. And I think that is one of the origins of the Roman ideas of civil war is Greek tragedy. So I would take issue with David Armitage. When Armitage's book came out, I was part of a panel that responded to it in London, and I was there as the literary person. So I did actually talk a bit about this, about Greek tragedy, and I think that's what Longley's talking about there at the end. He's thinking about Greek tragedy and the way that, entering the home, the way that politics and war enters the home is the source of so much Greek tragedy. So, yeah, it's a good point.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. You started with the Romans, and I wonder, this is just a thought that occurred to me in the course of your talk, that one of their most important founding myths is of Romulus and Remus,
Yeah.
which is of fratricide and is a sort of metaphor for civil war. Do you think that is, I assume, but I wonder what your comment is, that is a very unusual type of founding myth about brothers killing brothers? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so obviously, so I just talked about one sort of motif of Civil War poetry. That another one, a sort of obvious one in a way, is the brothers fighting, fratricidal conflict, and I think it's Benedict Anderson in his great book, Imagining Communities, talks about the reassurance of fratricide, which is an interesting phrase in a way that founding myth. That for some reason that kind of founding myth of two brothers fighting seems to provide a certain vitality or vigor to Roman culture. So the horror of civil war is combined with that sort of, their society is also founded in a kind of image of civil war as well. So yeah, so one of the things I do is think about, I mean, if you take the poetry of Paul Muldoon, for instance, it's absolutely stacked with images of twins, doppelgangers, reflections. You have to be careful about this because Michael Longley is a twin. His twin brother died recently, and so he writes a lot about twins. But is that just because he himself is a twin? I would say not. You know, there's a wider significance to that. You know, and I think so. Northern Irish poetry is full of that. I think of twins fighting, and there are other classical poems that you may be aware of. The Thebaid by Statius as well. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a key motif. But I agree that it's a perverse. The Roman horror of civil war is also perversely bound up with their very frequent experience. Well, but also their foundation in it. Yeah. So you know, it has that. Yeah, the Romulus and Remus myth is important to this.
Could I try and frame this question, this notion as a question, and it's really to do with your future work. I've been watching this extraordinary BBC series, Once Upon a Time in Northern Ireland, which has been seen by remarkably few people. It's extraordinary. And what it is, anyone who hasn't seen it, it's reflections by people who are young during the Troubles and quite long interviews. I found it incredibly moving. And my question is this, before that all just vanishes, who is going to turn the incredible eloquence of some of those interviews into poetry so that it lives? I'm just concerned that these amazing witness statements just vanish, and because they're not poetic or because they don't have another literary form, they evaporate.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. Although I suppose, I mean, well, yeah, is poetry? I don't know how, you know, poetry is it how popular a form is it? I mean, I think in one way, you know, the Northern Irish poets, the Troubles, you know, here, you know, most of them now, you know, Longley would be one of the last, and Muldoon is a younger generation. I mean, how popular is poetry now? That in a way, the combination of poetry and politics that came out of the Troubles, I think everybody would agree, is one of the great cultural kind of responses of the last 100 years, probably in Western culture. But it required, you know, horrible things to happen for that, you know, some of that poetry to emerge. And so, yeah, I mean, well, I've got the TV programs. I've been watching that. I found it quite hard to watch that, actually, at times. And I saw stuff I'd never seen before, for sure. And one of the things I'm going to do in the project is, you know, I will think about, although it's based on poetry, I will think about other witness statements. I mean, one of the more speculative things that I suppose comes out of this is that, is there a kind of psychological reaction to civil war that is common? You know, does it go beyond simply literary tropes and images? Is there a kind of psychology of civil war? And there's some interesting sociological stuff written about why civil war is more violent than other wars. I think this came up a little bit earlier as well with, in the morning, and it's partly because you see it's against yourself. You know, the violence increases because you're fighting a mirror image of yourself. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that talk, and just a couple of points. Maybe I look forward to your future work, because I think there's a lot of value in the work of the Northern Irish poets arising out of the Troubles. I think we had a conflict. I don't think we quite got to a civil war, thankfully, but it was still a pretty serious conflict that could have deteriorated into a civil war. But as I've got older, I've appreciated poetry more, and I've 3 pictures in my house. One is Michael Longley in the poem Ceasefire, and I use the last 2 lines, which I'm sure you know, to describe what we've had to do in respect of dealing with the past and the legacy issues. The other is John Hewitt and his definition of identity, which is an inclusive identity, and certainly a lesson going forward. Seamus Heaney, 2 buckets are easier carried than one. I stand in between, which is maybe Northern Ireland's place in the future. And you were taught by Frank Ormsby, and he's the one I haven't got yet, but it's the willow forest. And the symbolism, if you know that poem, and maybe you could reflect on that, because it's if you get things wrong, the willow forest is really what he says, that you plant a forest because people have left, and that the symbolism around that, and that's from his work in the Balkans.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm in total agreement with you about the cultural achievement of that poetry. And I was being taught by Frank Ormsby just around the time he was putting together the anthology A Rage for Order, which is Blackstaff Press, which I much recommend. It's an incredible collection. Yeah, I mean, I'll think about that. I mean, I don't have an immediate response. I mean, I think that's an imagery. I mean, the images I've been looking at are ones of division, I suppose, and there are, one of the things, and it's a bit like the Romulus and Remus myth, in that 2 brothers are in constant conflict, but yet they're also unified, is that there is a strange, in the kind of self-reflexive violence that you find in a lot of Civil War poetry, there is a strange hope in that the 2 people are still bound together in a way. The great literary critic Christopher Ricks has talked about this. He talks about self-reflexive imagery in Muldoon and Heaney, and says that there's a strange kind of hope in the conflict between the 2 figures, the 2 brothers or whatever, that they're still there together, they're still unified in some way, and that something can come out of that. So buy that if you will, but I do think there's other imagery that will of potential unity, and I guess Ormsby, that one is one of them.
Thanks again for a terrific talk. Just a very brief point and then a question. The point is just about David Armitage. I mean, I do understand him to be saying not that what we might call civil war couldn't exist in the Greek world, but that the Greeks themselves didn't have a concept for it, that the polis, which is the city politically defined, if there's an internal conflict, then by definition it's failed, it's ceased to exist. And that therefore, in that sense, the Greeks themselves couldn't have the concept of a civil war, whereas the Romans with the civis precisely could. And the other founding image, of course, of Rome is Virgil's Aeneid, and Virgil is in no doubt that this wasn't a civil war. That's to say the Greco-Trojan War, because the Trojans are the ones who escape and as a people then found Rome, which is the second foundation myth of Rome. But my question is, I take all you're saying and so on about the intimacy and the particular horror of civil war and how that's translated into poetry. The question is this: are we in danger of drawing too sharp a distinction between so-called interstate wars, which we see as just political and to do with states and elites, and civil wars? Is there not, in some interstate wars, particularly in the 20th century, a civil war aspect? And I'm not talking about a European civil war that goes from 1914 to 1945. What I mean is, once an artists and poets are particularly open to this, you have a notion of a common civilization, something that is shared. Then when you fight, it becomes fratricidal, and there is that element of a civil war, so that some of the things you're talking about in the First World War poets, one also finds the strange meeting of Wilfred Owen, where it's precisely the fratricidal conflict with the German and the hope, in a sense, that comes out of that, because there is the unity of the conflict. And so the question within that is, how sharp a distinction in Michael Longley's poems, who's written so much, of course, about the First World War, would you draw between that and his references to civil war in the North, or are there connections, nuances of connection between them?
Well, I certainly think. I mean, I think that's been the connection that's usually been made with Longley. That he does explicitly, of course, think about the Great War. So I guess I'm trying to offer a little corrective to that and say, that civil wars are different. And I do think that partly why I chose the image today. I mean, you can be invaded by another country, but it's not quite the same as being attacked by the person down the street who enters your home. It's a different. You're facing an enemy that you can other in ways that you can't other in a civil war. Potentially, you other them in more, the process of othering is different. So, yeah, of course. I mean, I think there are some overlaps between great war poetry, say, but I think the concluding distinction that I left with, which is Edna Longley herself, I don't know why she's, speaking directly with her husband about these things, but the distinction she makes between that poem with Civil War elegy, compared in distinction to Great War elegy, I think is the one I'm trying to trace. But I agree that with that, there are some overlaps, of course. But I still think, yeah, and when it comes from the Roman horror, there's something about the horror of Civil War which is still, I guess, a Freudian might call it sort of, it's the unhomely, something. The homely is made unhomely, and that causes a particular type of psychological reaction, I think.
Thank you very much for your talk. You just asked you had an open remark there at the very beginning, just throwing out the possibility of there being echoes of this in the Gaelic traditions in these islands. Yeah. I can't claim any particularly great expertise on that. The only thing I'm aware of is that, and you very, very well be aware of this, Shivra Aiken, historian, has recently written a book which looks at some of the prose literature in Irish on the Civil War and the fact that actually there weren't as many silences as we sometimes think. Now, that's prose, that's not poetry. The only other thing I could think of, and I'm sure people that would know 17th, 18th century Irish poetry better than I could give you many examples, but an almost contemporary example is the late great Máire Vacaty, also known as Máire Cruz O'Brien, a controversial figure in Irish poetry circles, but certainly a woman to be reckoned with. And she has a poem, I can't bring exact title, but she has a poem which I think she writes in 76 or 86, and it's an imaginary conversation between herself and her late father, Sean McEntee, a Belfast man, and of course one of the Republican builders of Fianna Fáil in the state subsequently. And it's just her having a discussion with him outside the GPO in 76 or 86. And it's basically about her own ambivalence about violence. Now, that's not directly Civil War, but it's a kind of an internal dialogue with oneself. And there's the kind of northerner, southerner dimension there as well. And I know that that's covered in Louis Dupuir's documentary, which he made with Vacaty, which is on the T.G. Cahir player, I think. Okay.
Okay, well, thanks for that. That's very useful. Yeah, it's one of the things I'm interested in. Do you need a common language to make war civil, or do these these things? I guess if you went to the speculative end of things, that there's a kind of psychological reaction that you can trace through periods, then you would expect to find it in other languages. One of the things I looked at, coming back to the previous question as well, is Spanish Civil War and English poetry written in the Spanish Civil War, and that's quite different. That doesn't have these motifs that I identify as characteristic of Civil War, which was one of the things that suggested to me that there was something different about the experience of domestic Civil War. So going to someone else's Civil War and fighting in it does not quite produce the same motifs, even though you can see the fratricide happening in front of you. But yeah, I mean, anybody, anybody who has any thoughts about whether these motifs appear in Irish language writing, that's very helpful. Thanks. I'll have a look at those.
Good time for just one or two more.
Okay.
I thought one of the main differences between interstate war and civil war would be that an interstate war is largely about territory, and a civil war is largely about ideas and ideology. I mean, is that reflected in the poetry?
I guess it is. Yeah, I guess because the territory being fought over is the home, as you were, or it's the estate or whatever. It's it's not some foreign field. So it's not new territory. It's the territory that's already possessed is being fought over between two sides. So yeah, you don't. Yeah, I think that couldn't put my finger on anything explicit about that, but I think that's my feeling with that. That would be broadly true. That is a distinction, of course. Civil war isn't in the same extent. It's, people are trying to gain territory, but it's not. It's territory that's already owned, as it were, by the people who are fighting. they're trying to regain their own territory. As opposed to, I mean, you could, if you look at somebody when I was writing my grant application and I was talking about, I mentioned Russia, the invasion of Russia into Ukraine was a shock to people because people are so used to civil war, not these other types of war. Somebody said, well, from a Russian point of view, I think they're fighting a civil war against Ukraine. So there is that, perspective sometime as well is important too.
Going back to the question about who's going to write the poetry of the Northern Ireland Troubles, I think that one of the problems for poets writing contemporaneously about troubles, particularly in a world of wall-to-wall media, is that they become politicized. That they'd be seen to be taking one side or the other. And maybe the answer to the question is, well, Seamus Heaney wrote the Bog Body poems, which are about horrific events that happened centuries before in another country.
Yeah.
But he was really writing about the Troubles in a very visceral way.
Yeah.
Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, I mean, those poems are, feature largely in my work. Yeah, for sure. They display many of these motifs. Yeah.
Nick, thank you very much indeed for, as I mentioned earlier, a stimulating paper which has provoked a wide-ranging discussion that we've thoroughly enjoyed. I was reminded, with reference to Yeats, of lines with regard to his experience of the revolutionary period in Ireland. We've fed the heart on fantasies, the heart's grown brutal from the fair, more substance in our enmities than in our love. And that resonated with me throughout what you were discussing. So thank you very much indeed. We're very grateful.
Thanks very much.